The hawk screamed before anyone had finished praying. It came from the direction of Sentinel Bluff, that long, raw cry cutting through the dry air, like something torn open.
See
Every
this
head in
here.
the Redemption
It's
Cemetery
Father's
turned toward
hand.
the sound.
Are you
Every head but
certain?
one. May Aldrin stood
It
at the
looks
edge of her
different
husband's
somehow.
grave and did not move.
Right there, Cal.
She did
See
not
the scene.
flinch at the
Got it.
cry, did
Stand
not
back.
follow the gaze of her neighbors, did not reach for the handkerchief that Mrs. Doris Harper kept pressing gently into her hand. She stood with her black dress pulling in the hot wind and her dark hair unraveling
We'll
slowly
rig
at
the
the
pulley
back of her
system
neck.
right here at the
And she
entrance.
looked at
But what
Sentinel
about the
Bluff
stress
the
on
way
this
a
support
person
beam?
looks at something they
She's
have
right,
been thinking
Silas.
about
It
for a
looks
very
weak.
long time. The cliff rose at the far end of the valley like a wall the earth had built to remind people of their smallness. Hundreds of feet of layered sandstone, red and orange and bone white in the afternoon sun, running the length of a mile before it curved north and disappeared into the higher country. It cast no shadow this time of day. It gave no shelter. It offered nothing a rancher could graze, nothing a farmer could plow, nothing a merchant could measure and sell. Most people in Redemption had stopped seeing it years ago, the way people stopped seeing mountains they have always lived beside. May saw it. She had always seen it. The pastor's voice moved through the gathered crowd low, in practice shaped by 100 funerals before this one. The words fell around May without landing. Ashes to ashes. The Lord is my shepherd. The words that towns use when they do not know what else to do with a body and a grief too large to look at directly. She heard them the way a person hears rain on a roof in another room. Familiar, distant, unimportant. Eli Hatch had been 23 years old. He had been strong in the specific way that men who work underground become strong deep through the shoulders, careful with his hands, always aware of the weight above him. He had laughed easily and worked without complaint, and he had loved May in the quiet, persistent way that some men love without announcement, without decoration, simply by being present every morning when she woke, and every evening when the light failed. Now he was not present, and the morning would come again, tomorrow regardless. The first shovel of dirt hit the pine box and May closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them and looked back at the cliff. 3 people noticed this. Mrs. Harper, who stood close enough to feel the stillness of May's shoulders. Edmund Crane, who stood at the back of the gathered crowd in his good coat, with his hat in his hands, watching with the particular attention of a man who watches everything and remembers all of it. And Cal Aldrin, 17 years old, who stood 2 steps behind his sister and understood nothing about what she was looking at, but understood perfectly that she was already somewhere else. After the service, the town of Redemption did what small towns have always done. It descended on the house of the bereaved, carrying food and sympathy and advice in quantities that no one could reasonably consume. May's house was small, 3 rooms, a fireplace, a covered porch that listed slightly to the left because Eli had never quite gotten around to fixing the support beam. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Eli's boots stood beside the door exactly where he had left them 3 mornings ago when he went to work. His hammer hung on a peg near the window. The chair he had favored beside the fireplace still held the shape of a man who was no longer in it. The women of Redemption arranged casseroles on the kitchen table and patted May's hand and told her that time heals. The men of Redemption stood in doorways and talked about the mine and shook their heads and did not meet her eyes. Mrs. Harper moved through it all like a woman managing weather, gentle and efficient, redirecting conversations, refilling cups, keeping the room from becoming something May could not bear. Edmund Crane did not stay long. He offered his condolences with the precision of a man who has offered them many times before, shook Cal's hand and left. He was 51 years old and he owned the general store and the grain warehouse and a controlling interest in 2 of the 4 working mines east of Redemption. He had built the better part of his fortune by understanding before other men did what a place needed, and then making himself the only source of it. He was not unkind. He was simply always positioned slightly ahead of events. When the last neighbor finally left at dusk, May stood in the kitchen alone and listened to the house breathe. The boots by the door, the hammer on the peg, the chair with its indented seat cushion. She touched the hammer handle. The wood was cold. She held her hand there for one long moment, not moving, not pressing, simply resting her palm against the thing he had last held. Then she walked to the bedroom and knelt beside the bed and pulled out the old wooden chest that had come west with her grandfather 40 years before she was born. Cal appeared in the doorway. He had her grandfather's build wide through the shoulders already with hands that were going to be large, and he watched her the way younger siblings watch older ones when they sense a decision forming. May opened the chest. Inside 2 wool blankets, a surveyor's compass missing its glass cover, A collection of rock samples wrapped in cloth and labeled in careful handwriting. 3 books on mineralogy so old their spines had cracked and been repaired with strips of leather. A rolled collection of hand-drawn maps, pages of numbered notes, and beneath all of it folded in oilskin a legal document in faded ink. May lifted the document carefully, unfolded it, smoothed it flat against her knee. Sentinel Bluff, 1 acre of Arizona territory transferred to Aldous Aldrin in the year 1857, transferred upon his death to his granddaughter May Aldrin in the year 1884. Worthless land. Those were the exact words Edmund Crane had used at the property office the previous year when the deed had first come up in conversation. Worthless land. Nothing a person could do with a cliff face but break their hands on it. Cal took a step into the room. What is that? The cliff. Grandfather's land. Cal frowned. What about it? May did not answer immediately. She set the deed aside and reached deeper into the chest, moving past the rock samples, past the surveying tools, until her hand found a book she had not seen in 3 years. Smaller than the mineralogy text. Soft leather cover worn to the color of old honey. A brass clasp, tarnished but still functional. Inside the front cover, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult, 2 words: Aldous Aldrin. Private. She opened it. The first page held a single line written above all the entries, not dated, not attributed, simply stated the way a man states something he has come to understand so thoroughly that it no longer requires argument or explanation. The earth does not forget. People do. May held the page for a moment, then she turned to the first entry. It was dated June 1864. Aldous had been 52 years old, newly arrived in Arizona territory after 4 decades in the Appalachian coal country of West Virginia, where he had spent his working life underground, learning the language of rock, the way other men learn the language of business or war. He had written in the manner of a man speaking to himself, short observations, precise measurements, occasional flashes of something close to excitement that he seemed to distrust and immediately qualify. Rode out to the bluff today. The formation runs approximately 1 mile north to south. Sandstone primary with significant limestone intrusion along the upper third. The kind of layering I saw in the Allegheny backcountry in 1841 before the Donaldson Seam dried up. That seam had held water for 40 years. The geology here is not dissimilar. May turned pages. Cal sat down on the floor beside the chest and said nothing, watching her face. Entry after entry. Aldous had returned to Sentinel Bluff with the systematic patience of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. He measured, he sketched, he noted changes in color and texture and the direction of natural fractures. He recorded the temperature variation between the sunlit face and the recessed sections. He traced moisture patterns after the rare rains. He observed the vegetation at the base of the cliff and what it suggested about what lay beneath the surface. And slowly, across years of notation, a picture formed. Water did not come to Sentinel Bluff from the sky. It came from inside. A system of fractures running deep into the higher country pulled meltwater from the mountains and carried it down through the stones slowly over decades, collecting in pockets and channels invisible from the outside. The cliff was not dry. The cliff was holding something. May's hand slowed. She was near the end now. Entry dated March 12, 1882. Aldous had been 69 years old, 5 months from death. 3rd year back at the North Face. The blue-gray sandstone layer, 3rd stratum from the base of the main formation, shows consistent moisture variation that cannot be explained by surface exposure. Temperature drop in the shaded recess confirms subsurface activity. If I am right about the fracture line running northeast from the upper cavity, the accumulation behind that layer would be significant. Not a river, not a spring in the conventional sense, but enough. In a country like this, enough is everything. May turned to the final entry. Her hands had gone very still. March 29, 1882. The handwriting was slightly less steady than in earlier entries. The letters leaned more than usual. I am not going to reach it. The body does not cooperate the way it once did, and there are days now when the bluff seems further than it is. But the land is recorded and the deed is clean, and I have made arrangements. May reads well. May pays attention. I have watched her since she was small enough to sit in the bed of the wagon, and she has her mother's stubbornness and something else besides that I have not been able to name except to say that she does not look at the ground when she is frightened. She looks up. Find the 3rd layer of blue-gray stone. The water is behind it. May sat for a long time without moving. Outside, the desert dark was complete now. The stars hard and close, the way they only are in open country, And somewhere out toward the bluff, a coyote started and stopped and started again. The sound came through the thin walls of the house like something passing. She was 19 years old. Her husband had been buried this afternoon. She had $14 in a tin box on the kitchen shelf and a horse that was 15 years old and 3 months of flour in the pantry. And she had a cliff. She read the last entry again, slowly the way her grandfather had taught her to read anything important, looking not just at the words, but at what the words were trying to carry. Cal had fallen asleep against the wall. He looked very young in the lamplight, younger than 17. His arms crossed over his chest and his head dropped to the side. He had dark circles under his eyes that had not been there a month ago. May closed the journal. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the blankets inside the chest and looked at the deed again. Sentinel Bluff, 1 acre, worthless land. The faintest movement crossed her face. Not quite a smile. Something more private than a smile. Her grandfather had never wasted anything. Not words, not lessons, not land. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time listening to her brother breathe, and to the desert wind moving along the eaves of the house, and she thought about water behind stone, and about patience, and about a man who had spent 20 years writing letters to a future he knew he would not live to see. In the morning, Cal brought news he had not meant to bring. He had been at the livery stable before dawn tending the horse, and he had overheard 2 men talking in the adjacent stall. Men who had been drinking the night before and had not yet recovered enough to be careful about what they said and where they said it. He told May at the kitchen table while she was making coffee, the words coming out in pieces, the way difficult things come out when the person speaking them is not sure they should be speaking them at all. The cross beam that had failed in the number 3 shaft of the Crane Mountain mine, the beam that had come down without warning and taken Eli Hatch and a man named Ortiz with it, had been flagged by the foreman 3 weeks before the accident. Written in the maintenance log. Needs immediate replacement. Crane was notified. The replacement had been ordered but not yet delivered, and the foreman had been told the shaft could keep operating in the meantime. Cal stopped talking. He looked at his coffee cup. May stood at the stove with the pot in her hand and said nothing for a long time. The coffee pot was heavy. The handle was the kind of heat that you feel but can manage if you hold on. Outside, a rooster from somewhere down the road started up, and a dog answered it, and the ordinary morning sounds of redemption continued, as if nothing in the kitchen had just shifted. "Who told you this?" May asked. "Reston. He was the assistant foreman before Crane let him go last month. He's been drinking since." May set the coffee pot down carefully. She turned to the window. From this angle on a clear morning, you could see the top edge of Sentinel Bluff, catching the first light orange against the pale blue of the early sky. She stood there long enough that Cal got up and poured his own coffee. "May, I heard you. What are we going to do?" She turned from the window. She looked at her brother, 17 years old and frightened, in the specific way that young men are frightened when the world reveals itself to be less trustworthy than they had been led to believe. "We're going to have breakfast," she said, "and then we're going to go see about selling the furniture." Cal stared at her. "That's all?" "No," she said, "but that's first." She thought about Edmund Crane for a long time after that. She thought about him carefully, without the blurring that anger brings. She was not naive. She knew what the information meant. She knew that in a town like Redemption, a man like Crane was not someone you confronted with a dead foreman's drinking story and expected justice to follow from it, like water follows a channel downhill. But she also knew that debts have a way of accumulating in this world, whether or not the creditor is standing in front of you demanding payment. What Crane had done was written somewhere, in a maintenance log, in a foreman's memory, in the particular quality of the silence that fell whenever Eli Hatch's name came up near the men who had been on that shift. May could not spend her life waiting for a justice that might never arrive in the form she recognized. She could not bring Eli back. She was 19 years old with $14 and a cliff. She could build something that would outlast his opinion of her. She could do that. The week that followed shocked Redemption in the specific way that small towns are shocked when a young woman does something that no one predicted and that violates every reasonable expectation about grief and what grief is supposed to look like. May sold the house first. It went to the Prentice family who had been renting for 2 years and had the money saved. She got $400 for it, which was fair for Redemption in 1887, and she took the cash in an envelope and did not look back at the porch or the listing support beam or the 2 rooms where she had lived as Eli's wife for 3 years. She sold the furniture next, the table, the chairs, the bed frame, the chest of drawers that Eli had made himself from reclaimed lumber the winter before last. The rocking chair that he had built for her in the spring, sanded smooth, the joints fitted with a precision that had surprised her when she first saw it, because she had not known until then that he had that kind of patience. She held her hand on the back of that chair for one long moment in the empty room before the buyer came to collect it. Then she let it go. The extra horse, the winter blankets, the dishes she had brought from her mother's house, the iron cookware piece by piece, the small collection of books that had been hers before the marriage. She kept the grandfather's journal, the deed, the surveying compass, the rock samples, and a single wool blanket. Everything else went. By the end of the week, she had $700. People talked. Of course they talked. This is what towns do when they do not understand something. They talk about it until the talking makes them feel they have understood it, when all they have done is agree with each other. Mrs. Harper came to find May at the boarding house where she and Cal were staying and sat across the table with an expression that combined genuine concern with the particular distress that comes from watching someone make what appears to be a catastrophic mistake. "You sold the rocking chair," Mrs. Harper said. "Yes? Eli made that chair. I know. May, you don't have to do this. Whatever this is." Mrs. Harper spread her hands. "Grief does things to a person. It makes everything seem urgent. It makes things that can wait seem like they can't wait. You have time. There are people here who will help you." "I know there are," May said, "and I appreciate it." "Then let us help." May looked at the woman who had been her nearest neighbor for 3 years, who had brought soup when May was sick in her first winter in Redemption, who had sat up with her the night Cal had the fever at 15, and they did not know yet that he was going to be all right. She felt the full weight of what this woman was offering. "I need something different than help," May said. "I need room to work." Mrs. Harper looked at her for a long time. "The cliff," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." The older woman was quiet. Outside the boarding house window, the main street of Redemption moved in its ordinary way, horses and wagons, and men going about the business of a Thursday morning in a small Arizona town. "People are going to say things," Mrs. Harper said finally. "I know. Unkind things. I know that too." Mrs. Harper looked at her hands. Then she looked up. "Is there anything you need from me?" "Yes," May said. "If something happens to Cal or to me out there, I need someone who knows where we are." Mrs. Harper held her gaze. Then she nodded once with the finality of a woman making a commitment she intends to keep. Edmund Crane was less subtle. May went to the general store on Thursday morning to purchase supplies, and Crane was behind the counter in his shopkeeper's apron with 2 other men from the town council, and the conversation stopped when she came through the door in the particular way that conversations stop when the subject of them enters a room. She set her list on the counter. She read it aloud item by item and watched Crane's face as he tallied the order. 2 pickaxes, 4 steel drill bits, a sledgehammer, rope 200 feet, dynamite 6 sticks, nails 10 pounds, flour, coffee, salt, pork, a mule. Crane looked up from the list when she reached the dynamite. "You planning to do some blasting, Mrs. Hatch?" She had been using her married name, and she corrected this without thinking. "Aldrin," she said. "I've gone back to Aldrin." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalculation, the look of a man adjusting an estimate. "Miss Aldrin," he said, "that's a significant quantity of material for a woman on her own. My brother will be helping. Cal." Crane said the name the way men say the names of boys they consider inconsequential. "He's what, 16? 17, Cal said from the doorway where he had appeared without anyone noticing. Crane looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at May. "This is for the Sentinel property." "Yes. May I ask what you're planning to do with it?" "Build a home," she said. The silence that followed was not hostile exactly. It was the silence of a group of men confronting something they do not have a category for. Crane's expression moved through several stages: skepticism, something approaching concern, and then settled finally at a particular kind of condescension that May recognized. She had seen it before. It was the expression that came before the sentence about grief and good judgment. "May," he said, dropping the formality now the way men do when they want to sound reasonable and paternal at the same time. "That cliff face is not buildable land. It never has been. Your grandfather purchased it. God rest him, under a misapprehension about its potential. There is no soil up there. There is no water. There is no reasonable way to—" "I'll take everything on the list," May said. "And the mule." She paid in cash. She counted out the bills on the counter bill by bill, and she did not hurry, and she did not look at Crane while she did it. She heard one of the men behind her say something under his breath, and she heard the sound that men make when they are trying not to laugh, and she kept counting. Later that afternoon, as she and Cal loaded supplies into the wagon, she heard Crane's voice from the store porch carrying to where two men were talking near the hitching post. Grief has broken that girl. No other explanation for it. You hate to see it. The men murmured agreement. May lifted a coil of rope and set it in the wagon bed without changing her expression. Cal looked at her sideways. Does it bother you? He asked quietly. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave to most questions. No, she said. Not much. Why not? She picked up the next coil. Because in 2 years, they'll stop talking about what I'm doing and start asking how I did it. Cal was quiet for a moment. And if they don't, then we'll have a house in a cliff and water and food and something to be proud of, she said. And they can go on talking. They left Redemption at first light on a Friday morning in late October of 1887. The wagon was loaded to the boards with supplies, the old mule pulling steadily, May on the seat with the reins, and the grandfather's journal on the bench beside her. Cal, in the wagon bed watching the town shrink behind them as they moved across the valley floor toward the bluff. A dozen people saw them go. Most of them stopped to watch. Some of them shook their heads. None of them waved. The drive to Sentinel Bluff took the better part of 2 hours across broken ground. The valley floor was not flat. It rose and dipped through shallow arroyos and past stands of juniper and through stretches of red dirt that the wagon wheels cut into deeply enough to make the mule work. And all the while, the cliff grew in front of them, its full scale becoming apparent only as they drew close enough to lose the rest of it in perspective. By the time they reached the base, the cliff was not a feature of the landscape anymore. It was the landscape. It rose so far above them that May had to tilt her head back to find the top edge, and even then the upper section was hazy with distance. The stone was layered in colors that changed as the morning sun moved across it, deep red at the base fading through orange and gold, to a near-white limestone band near the top. The wall ran in both directions as far as they could see, curving gently northward, ancient and enormous. Cal climbed down from the wagon and stood with his hands at his sides. It's bigger than it looks from town, he said. Most things are. May stepped down from the wagon seat. She left the reins tied and walked to the cliff face until she was close enough to touch it. She stood there for a moment just looking. Then she raised her right hand and pressed it flat against the stone. She closed her eyes. This was something her grandfather had taught her without words. She had watched him do it once when she was 11 years old, and he had driven her out to see the bluff on a Sunday afternoon. He had walked up to the rock face without ceremony and placed both hands on it, and he had stood there for so long without speaking that she had grown bored and sat down in the dirt. When he finally turned around, his face held an expression she had not seen on him before or since. The expression of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has finally confirmed it is where he believed it to be. He had never explained to her what he was doing. He had simply let her watch. Now she understood. You were not looking for anything specific. You were reading. The way the stone gave slightly under pressure in some places and resisted absolutely in others. The temperature differential between sections, this part of the cliff face caught morning sun, and the rock held it but 3 feet to the left. The stone was noticeably cooler in a way that sun position alone could not explain. The texture variations, rough limestone, smooth sandstone, the gritty transition zones where the layers met and the bonding was less certain. Fracture lines you could feel more than see. She opened her eyes. She moved along the face, slowly, fingertips trailing across the surface. She had read the journal so many times in the 2 weeks since she found it that she could hear her grandfather's voice behind the words. Blue-gray sandstone, third layer from the base, moisture variation inconsistent with surface exposure. She found it 30 feet from where the mule stood. A section of stone maybe 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall that sat in a shallow natural recess in the cliff face. The color was slightly different here, not dramatically, but noticeably to someone looking for it, a blue-gray tint where the surrounding rock was more purely red-orange. The surface was cooler than the stone on either side of it. And at the lower edge of the section, barely visible a thin dark line where the stone met the earth below the faintest suggestion of a zone where moisture had been present consistently enough to stain. May stepped back and looked at the section. Then she looked at the cliff above it, reading the geometry of layers, the way the upper strata curved where the deep fracture lines ran. She looked at the ground at the base, at the vegetation, at the way certain plants had established themselves in a line, extending outward from this section, when elsewhere the base of the cliff was bare. She thought about her grandfather, 69 years old, standing in this same place, looking at this same evidence, knowing what it meant, and knowing he could not reach it. She thought about a man who leaves everything he knows to someone he loves because he trusts her capacity more than he trusts the years he has left. She thought about Eli's boots still standing by the door of a house that was no longer hers. Then she picked up the pickaxe. She set her feet. She drew back. She looked at the blue-gray section of stone one final time, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with the focused attention of someone who has been given something precious and intends to be worthy of it. She swung. The first strike rang out across the valley like a bell. The impact traveled up through the handle into her arms and shoulders with a force she had not quite anticipated, and the stone sent back a shower of small chips and dust, and the sound echoed off the cliff face and traveled outward across the flat valley floor, bouncing between the walls of the arroyo to the north, and returning as something that sounded less like a single blow and more like a declaration. The mule's ears moved. A bird rose from a juniper stand 200 yards away. Cal stood in the wagon bed and watched his sister. May reset her feet, drew back, swung again and again and again. The sound of it carried across the valley. There were farmers in their fields 2 miles away who heard something that morning and looked toward the bluff and saw a small figure at the base of the cliff making a sound like the first word in a very long argument. May did not stop for water for 2 hours. Her palms split before noon and she wrapped them in strips cut from her spare shirt without breaking the rhythm of the work. Cal climbed down eventually and took up the second pickaxe without being asked, and the two of them worked in the particular silence of people engaged in something difficult and real. The kind of silence that is not empty but full packed with concentration and physical effort, and the small, constant adjustments of body and tool. By the time the sun reached the western edge of the valley and the shadow of the cliff began to spread across the valley floor, there was a depression in the stone 6 inches deep and 4 feet wide, where the blue-gray layer met the surrounding rock. Barely a beginning, a mark, nothing more. An argument that a cliff face could be persuaded to open. May stepped back and looked at what they had done. Cal set down his pickaxe and stretched his back. His face dust-covered, his hands raw. He looked at the small wound in the stone face and then looked at his sister. "That's not very much," he said. "No," May agreed. "The cliff is very large." "Yes." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Do you trust the earth?" May turned to look at him. 17 years old, tired to the bone, covered in red dust, asking the right question. "Yes," she said. "Do you trust me?" Cal looked at the depression in the stone, then at the cliff stretching away in both directions, then back at May. "Yes," he said. "Then pick up the pickaxe." He did. They worked until the light gave out. They ate beside a small fire at the base of the cliff, listening to the desert cool around them, the way the temperature drops in the Arizona territory, the moment the sun is gone, immediate and complete. Above them, the cliff held the last of the orange light longer than the surrounding land, as if the stone were reluctant to give up the day. Cal fell asleep before the fire had fully died. May sat up a little longer, the journal open on her knee, reading by the last of the firelight. She turned to the first page and read the single line her grandfather had written above all his entries. She had read it a dozen times since finding the journal. But tonight, with the cliff above her and the pickaxe blistered into her palms, and the whole impossible enterprise just barely begun, the words landed differently. They landed the way things land when you have finally stopped reading them and started living them. She closed the journal. She lay down on her bedroll and looked up at the stars above Sentinel Bluff, hard and close and indifferent, and she thought about her grandfather standing where she was standing 20 years ago, looking at the same stars above the same stone. He had been right. She was going to prove it. She fell asleep to the sound of the desert, which is the sound of a great deal of patience. The first room took 31 days. May knew this because she marked each morning in the back of the grandfather's journal a single vertical line, the way men mark time when they want to stay honest about how much of it is passing. She did not do it out of impatience. She did it because Aldous Aldrin had kept meticulous records of everything, and she had decided early on that she would do the same, that whatever she was building here would be documented the way serious work is documented, by someone who intends it to last and wants those who come after to understand how it was done. 31 lines, 31 mornings of waking before the sun in the canvas tent they had pitched at the base of the cliff, boiling coffee over a small fire, reading 2 pages of the journal, while the light came up, and then walking to the face of the stone and beginning again. The work changed her hands first. The blisters came in the first week and broke, and came back harder, and by the third week, the skin across her palms had thickened into something that no longer felt like skin at all, more like the leather of an old saddle, stiff and impervious to what had previously made her wince. Her shoulders changed next. The deep muscles along her upper back reorganized themselves around the demands of the pickaxe, and she began to feel the strain less and the power more, the way an instrument eventually learns to resonate with the music being played on it. Cal's hands changed too, though he was younger, and it happened faster for him the way most things happen faster at 17. He had grown 2 inches since October, and his voice had finished its long descent to something that occasionally surprised him when he heard it, and the work on the cliff was turning him from a boy who was large into a young man who was strong, which are different things, the first being an accident of growth and the second being something you earn. They had developed a rhythm without discussing it. May led and Cal followed, not because she required this, but because he trusted her navigation the way people trust someone who has already consulted the map. She decided where to dig each morning based on the journal and her own accumulated reading of the stone, which sections would yield most readily to the pick, which required the steel drill, and the careful placement of dynamite, which should be left alone for reasons she sometimes could explain and sometimes could only feel. Cal executed with a precision that improved daily learning to let the tool do the work rather than forcing it, learning that stone argues back if you approach it wrong. The opening in the cliff face widened, 1 foot, 3 feet, 5. The initial depression became a channel. The channel became an alcove. The alcove became something that a person could stand inside. May measured each expansion in the journal with the same notation her grandfather had used. Dimensions, rock composition, temperature, moisture, the direction of natural fracture lines, anything the stone was willing to tell her about itself and what lay beyond. From Redemption, people came to watch. This happened most often on weekends, when the farms and stores were quieter, and the particular restlessness of small-town life turned outward, looking for something to observe. They would ride out in 2s and 3s, park their horses or wagons at a distance, and stand in the thin shade of their hats, watching the 2 figures at the base of the cliff make their repetitive, argumentative sounds against the stone. Children came with their parents and grew bored faster than the adults did, which suggested that children have more honest instincts about what is interesting. Men came with the expressions of people watching a prolonged demonstration of poor judgment. Women came with expressions more complicated than that, something that included concern and something else harder to name. The nickname arrived in the second week. May heard it first from Cal, who had ridden into Redemption for supplies on a Thursday and returned with his jaw set in the specific way it set when he was managing something he would rather express differently. "They're calling you something," he said, unloading flour from the saddlebag without looking at her. "I know," she said. She had suspected as much. "Cliff Witch." He said it like a man disarming a trap by naming it first. "It's all over town now." May was kneeling at the base of the alcove, examining a section of the lower wall. She ran her fingers along a horizontal seam where the color of the stone shifted from red-orange to something grayer, a transition she had been watching for 3 days. "Cooler here, noticeably cooler." "Does it bother you?" Cal asked. "No." "Why not?" She sat back on her heels. "Because a name is just a way of not understanding something. When they understand it, the name will change." She picked up the smaller pickaxe. "Hand me the drill." The nickname became currency in Redemption, the kind of phrase that travels fast because it satisfies something in the people who repeat it, the human need to organize the unfamiliar into a form that makes it manageable and slightly contemptible. Cliff Witch. It implied madness in the register of amusement rather than genuine concern, which was the most socially comfortable category for a young widow doing something no one could explain. Edmund Crane used it with a benevolent shake of his head. The men at the saloon used it as the punchline to several variations of the same joke. Even people who meant May no particular ill used it because it was there, and it was easy, and it made the inexplicable seem less so. What none of them knew, what they could not have known from their comfortable distance across the valley, was that on the 28th day of the work, May had knocked through into something new. She had been working alone in the late afternoon, Cal having gone to collect water from the creek a half-mile east, when her pickaxe struck a section of the upper wall, and the sound changed. Not dramatically, not the way things change in stories with a boom and a flood of light. The sound simply went from the dense thud of solid stone to something slightly hollower, a fractionally different resonance, the difference between knocking on a solid wall and knocking on a wall with empty space behind it. May stopped. She set the pickaxe down. She held both palms an inch from the surface without touching it and felt the temperature coming off the stone like a tide. Cold. Not just cool. Cold in the way of something separating the outside air from a space that had its own climate entirely. She picked up the drill. She worked carefully, more carefully than she had worked at any point since the first day, choosing her points by field drilling, short holes in a pattern that would let her remove the stone in sections, rather than shattering it the way her grandfather's notes described working around a feature you wanted to preserve. It took 2 hours. Her arms ached with the tiredness that has moved past pain into something almost peaceful. When the last section came away, cool air moved against her face. The alcove beyond was not large, 8 feet deep, perhaps 6 feet wide. The ceiling was low enough that May had to duck to enter, but the floor was level and the walls were sound, and the temperature inside was noticeably strikingly different from the desert air outside. May stood in the middle of the small space and turned slowly and breathed. Cold, dry, still. She put her hand against the back wall. The stone here was a deeper gray than anything she had encountered so far, and it was cold in the way of something that has been cold for a very long time, a cold that lived in the rock rather than sitting on its surface. She was inside the third layer. When Cal came back with the water, he found her sitting outside the tent in the dark, with the journal open on her knee and the lamp burning low beside her. And he poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and waited. "We have a storage room," she said. He looked at the enlarged opening in the cliff face. Inside, yes, cold in there, colder than it should be. Cal thought about this. Why? Because the stone behind that wall is doing something. She looked up from the journal. "We're going to build here, Cal, not just a room, a house, a real one. In the cliff." Yes. He sat with this for a moment. He was 17 and he had good instincts, and he knew when his sister was telling him something true versus something hoped. He could not always tell which was which, but he was getting better at it. "How long?" he asked. "Months, more than that." Cal nodded slowly. He looked at the opening in the cliff and at the night beyond it and at the hard stars above the valley. He had been called worse things than the brother of the cliff witch. He had been called poor and fatherless and second-hand and second-rate. Most of the things a boy gets called when he arrives in a new place, with nothing particular to recommend him except his own willingness to keep going. "All right," he said. They moved into the first chamber 6 days after May broke through. The tent came down and its canvas became additional insulation, for the entrance hung over a frame of cut juniper branches that Cal constructed with a precision that surprised even him. The first night inside the stone was unlike any night May had experienced. She lay on her bedroll in the dark, and the cold air sat around her like a presence, and the walls that were invisible in the darkness pressed close in a way that should have felt confining, and instead felt like held breath, like being inside something that was simply very, very patient. No wind, no sound of the desert, nothing moving. In the morning, the entrance frame held. The cold chamber remained cold. The rough stone walls of the living space showed no cracks or instability overnight. May walked the perimeter and noted everything in the journal, and felt something she recognized after a moment as certainty. Not the certainty of knowing how things would end. The certainty of knowing you are in the right place, doing the right thing, which is a different and rarer feeling, and one that does not require any guarantee about outcomes. Cal heated water for coffee on the small fire they had built at the entrance, and the smoke went exactly where May had predicted, up through the narrow natural fissure she had identified in the rock above the fire position, pulled by a draft that the cliff itself created between its sun-warmed upper face and its cool interior. The fire burned clean and the smoke vanished, and the warmth spread through the chamber slowly and then held the stone, absorbing the heat and releasing it back through the hours. Cal looked at the ceiling where the smoke should have been collecting and wasn't. He said nothing for a long time. Then, "How did you know that would work?" The journal described it. "My grandfather found the fissure. He mapped the draft direction." May wrapped both hands around her tin cup. He'd seen it in the coal country, mines that breathe, chambers that manage their own air. He was something, Cal said. May agreed. It was in the 4th week of living in the cliff that Silas Greer appeared. May had seen him before at a distance. He was the blacksmith on Redemption's West End, a large, quiet man of around 50 broad through the chest, with hands that had been formed by the same process as the tools they made, through the application of sustained heat and pressure until the right shape emerged. He was not native to Redemption, had arrived some years before May without fanfare, and established himself in the manner of a man who intends to be useful and nothing more. He was well regarded in the practical way that skilled tradespeople are well regarded in places that depend on them without social warmth, without personal knowledge of the man behind the apron. He had ridden out twice to the base of the cliff and sat on his horse at a distance watching. May had noticed him but said nothing. People came and watched. Most of them eventually went away. Silas did not go away. On a Tuesday morning, he rode up close enough to tie his horse and walk to the face of the cliff and stand behind May for a full 3 minutes examining her work without speaking. She was drilling at the time and did not stop. Cal watched the man from the side hand near the hatchet he kept on his belt, not expecting to use it, but aware that the option should exist. "You're cutting along the grain," Silas said. May stopped drilling. She stepped back and looked at him. Up close, he was older than she had estimated from a distance. The deep lines around his eyes suggested not just age, but a particular kind of watching, the weathering of someone who has spent years looking carefully at things that mattered. "Yes," she said. "That's not an obvious thing to know. My grandfather knew it." Silas looked at the section she had been working. He studied the cut lines, the angles, the way the removed stone had broken cleanly along the natural stratification, rather than fracturing randomly across it. He looked at the retaining wall she had begun constructing from the excavated material, the way the fitted stones angled slightly inward to use their own weight as a locking mechanism. He picked up one of her drill bits and turned it in his hand. The steel edge was worn to a thin flare, the cutting surface so degraded that the bit was removing more effort than stone with each strike. "You're losing a third of your force to a bad edge," he said. "More on the harder sections." "I know. I'm using what I have." Silas set the bit down on the ledge. "How much money do you have left?" The question was direct in a way that might have been rude from someone else. From him, it was simply direct. $43, Cal said from the side. Silas looked at him, then back at the bit. "I can make you better tools than these. Steel with proper tempering. Edges that will hold against this grade of sandstone." He set the bit back down. $43 covers the materials. May looked at him steadily. "That steel is worth more than $43. "I know what it's worth." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cliff, at the opening in its face, at the beginning of what was becoming something that had not existed here before. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled the way a building settles when its foundation is confirmed to be sound. "I want to see what happens next," he said. He left and came back 3 days later with 4 drill bits and a new pickaxe head, the steel a different color from the tools May had purchased from Crane's store, darker, with a surface quality that suggested the heat treatment had been done with more care than was strictly necessary. May took the smaller drill bit and pressed its cutting edge against the stone wall and felt the difference immediately. The bit caught and held rather than skidding. She looked at Silas. "Better," she said. "Yes." He did not elaborate. He came back the following week and the week after that. He brought tools or materials, sometimes stayed to watch for an hour, occasionally made an observation about the work that was so precisely targeted and technically specific that May began to pay attention to these observations, the way she paid attention to the journal as information from someone who understood more than they were currently explaining. On the 3rd visit, Cal found the papers. It was not intentional. Silas's saddlebag had fallen from the hitching post in the wind, and Cal had picked it up to rehang it, and the flap had come open and a folded sheaf of papers had slid halfway out. He caught them before they hit the ground, and in the catching, he saw what they were. Detailed technical drawings, elevation plans and cross-sections, notations in a hand that was smaller and more precise than Silas's casual speech would have suggested. Systems for collecting and directing water basin calculations, flow rates, structural load estimates for elevated channels. And in the lower right corner of each page, a small block of information that included a project name, a date, and a credential notation. S.W. Greer, licensed civil engineer, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Cal rehung the saddlebag and went back to work without saying anything until that evening, when Silas had gone and May was writing in the journal by lamplight. "He's an engineer," Cal said. "A real one, licensed." May looked up. Cal told her what he had seen. He described the drawings with the precision of someone who has looked at something carefully because he already understood it was important. May listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment. "Pennsylvania," she said. That's what it said. She thought about the tools, the quality of the steel, which was not the quality of a man producing commercial trade goods, but the quality of a man who understands load tolerances and failure points. The way he had looked at her retaining wall, not with the appreciation of someone recognizing craftwork, but with the attention of someone checking structural specifications. The comments about grain direction and force transfer that were not the observations of a blacksmith, but of someone who understood precisely why those things mattered. The next time Silas came, she was ready. "Why Pennsylvania?" she asked without preamble when he arrived at the cliff face. He stopped. He looked at her with the look of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and is deciding whether to walk through it. "I built things there," he said. "What kind of things?" The pause was longer this time. He set down the materials he had brought and looked out at the valley for a moment, at the flat, empty distance of Arizona territory, which is the kind of landscape that can absorb almost anything you need to set down in it. "A dam," he said. "Reservoir project outside Philadelphia. The calculations were mine. The oversight was mine. The approval to open the intake before the secondary bracing was complete, that was also mine." He turned back to face her. "It failed 11 months after completion. Flooding. 11 people." He said the number without inflection, which was not the same as saying it without feeling. "I was licensed, I was qualified, I made an error in judgment under pressure from the investors to proceed ahead of schedule, and 11 people died for it." May looked at him for a long time. "And you've been here since," she said. 15 years. Running from it. Living with it," he said. "There's a difference, though. It takes a while to find it." May was quiet. Outside the cliff, the afternoon light moved across the valley in the slow way of winter light, low and long-shadowed. The juniper smell came in on the wind, sharp and clean. "You have a skill," she said finally. "A real one. One that could be useful." "Yes. Then use it here." She looked at the cliff opening, at the growing structure of her terraces, at the work that was becoming something larger than two people with pickaxes could fully account for. "Whatever you did in Pennsylvania, you can't undo it. But you're here, and this is in front of you." She met his eyes. "Don't let the knowledge die with the guilt." Silas Greer stood very still for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that was too complicated to name directly. It included relief and something that might have been the first edge of purpose, returning after a long absence. He nodded, once, the way men nod when they have decided something they will not reverse. He picked up his tools and went to work. The terraces were Silas's formalization of something May had already been thinking about without yet knowing how to execute. The excavated stone could not simply be discarded. It was too much material, too substantial, and May had recognized from the journal that her grandfather had envisioned the cliff face itself as a growing structure, not just a shelter, but a place that could produce. But she did not know the engineering. She knew the principle, and she could see the outcome she wanted, but the mathematics of retaining walls on a slope, the load-bearing calculations for shelves of earth built into a rock face at various angles, the structural requirements to prevent the whole terrace system from becoming a slow-motion avalanche after the first significant rain, these were outside the range of what the grandfather's journal covered. Silas covered them. He spent 3 evenings at their fire with paper and pencil, working through the calculations with a speed that came from genuine mastery. He drew, he revised, he drew again. He showed May each revision and explained what had changed and why, and she asked questions with the directness of someone who is learning rather than performing, and he answered them the same way. By December, they had the first terrace framed. The work was different from the interior excavation, more visible, more exposed to the valley below. People in Redemption, who had been watching with comfortable certainty that the project would eventually collapse into failure, had begun to find the certainty less comfortable. Something was taking shape on the face of Sentinel Bluff that did not look like madness. It looked reluctantly and undeniably like construction. Cal overheard the shift one afternoon in town. The laughter was quieter, the jokes were fewer. Men who had previously dismissed the whole enterprise with a sentence were now asking questions, instead not of May, whom they were not yet ready to approach directly, but of each other. What is she building up there exactly? How is she keeping the terrace walls from washing? Where is she getting the stone for the retaining structure? He told May that evening. She noted it in the journal without comment. The first hard freeze came in December and slowed the outside terrace work. May used the slowed days to deepen the cold storage room, following the gray wall inward, and it was during this work on a gray January afternoon with Cal at the creek, and Silas not yet arrived, that she heard it. A sound so small that she first attributed it to the quality of silence inside stone, which is not true silence but the absence of the particular sounds that fill outdoor air, and which the ears sometimes fill with invented detail. She stopped working, held her breath. It came again. Drip. May raised the lantern. Drip. She moved toward the back wall of the cold chamber, toward the deepest section of gray stone, and held the lantern close. The wall was wet. Not condensation, not the surface moisture she had observed before, but a thin, active trickle tracking down the face of the stone from a fracture near the ceiling, gathering at a protrusion in the rock, 6 feet up and falling. Drop by drop by drop. Clear water. Cold water. Water that was coming from somewhere behind the stone, and had been coming. She understood this with a sudden wholeness that arrived not as thought, but as physical knowledge for a very long time. For years, for decades. Falling in this dark room to no one heard by nothing. May set the lantern down. She sat down on the floor of the cold chamber, her back against the side wall, her legs straight out in front of her, and she stared at the water falling from the crack in the stone. Her hands were in her lap. Outside, somewhere far below the valley was doing whatever valleys do. In January, the cattle moving toward the creek, the smoke rising from Redemption's chimneys, Edmund Crane, conducting the business of a man who has always had enough. And here inside the mountain water, exactly where Aldous Aldrin had said it would be. She thought about a man who spent 20 years returning to this place, an old miner from West Virginia coal country who had taught himself geology from 3 books and 40 years underground, who had walked out to this cliff alone on Sundays and studied the stone with his hands and written everything down in careful script because he believed in what he had found even when no one else did, who had died knowing he would never reach it, but certain that someone would. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. She did not sob. May Aldrin was not a woman who sobbed. But the tears came anyway quietly and without ceremony, the way water comes through stone, finding the path of least resistance, unstoppable once they found the way through. She sat in the cold dark of the chamber with the dripping of ancient water, keeping its slow time around her, and she cried for her grandfather, who had been right about everything, and for Eli, who had been kind and was gone, and for herself, 19 years old, and alone in a mountain in Arizona, with everything still ahead of her, everything still uncertain. And this water, this impossible patient water, telling her she was exactly where she needed to be. She did not hear Cal come back. He appeared in the entrance of the chamber and stopped. He saw his sister on the floor and the lantern beside her and the wet wall above. He did not speak. He walked in and sat down next to her close enough that their shoulders touched, and he looked at the water falling from the crack. They stayed like that for a long time. Finally, Cal said very quietly, "Is that it?" "Yes," May said. He nodded. He looked at the wall. He reached out and held his hand under the thin stream, and the water hit his palm and ran between his fingers and fell to the floor. "Cold," he said. "Yes." "It's real," he said. Not a question. Confirmation of something he had believed without quite knowing he believed it. "It's real," May said. They built a channel the next day, a shallow groove cut into the floor of the chamber, sloping slightly toward a natural low point in the stone. The water followed it. By evening, they had a basin the size of a washtub cut into the bedrock, filling slowly the surface still as glass in the lamplight. By the second morning, it was full. By the third, it was full and had been full through the night, which meant the flow rate exceeded their current needs, which meant there was more behind the stone than a seep, more than surface moisture, more than what a crack in a cliff could explain. May measured. She noted. She calculated in the margins of the journal the way her grandfather had calculated, adding her own numbers to his projections, testing his estimates against the reality of what the stone was producing. She told Silas when he arrived that week, and he went into the chamber and examined the crack in the wall and the basin below it, and the flow rate and the temperature and the formation of the surrounding stone. And when he came out, his expression was the expression of a trained engineer encountering something that validates a theory he has been quietly holding. "This is a fracture-fed system," he said, "not a spring. The water is moving through a network of cracks in the formation above and collecting behind this face." He looked at the cliff above them. "If the fracture network is what I think it is, there's a significant accumulation up there. More than you can currently access." How much more? He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Enough to make this valley different. May looked at the cliff. Then came the terrace failure. It happened on a Tuesday in February without warning and without proximate cause, which is the nature of failures in stone construction, when a hidden flaw in the underlying material has been waiting for sufficient load to express itself. A section of the second terrace retaining wall, 12 feet long and 5 feet high, separated from the cliff face, and came down in a controlled-seeming slide that lasted approximately 4 seconds and deposited several tons of carefully fitted stone and newly laid soil across the base of the cliff face. Cal was at the water channel when it happened. He was clear of the slide by 30 yards. He stood in the sudden silence after the last stone settled and looked at 3 weeks of work reduced to a rubble field, and felt the particular despair that arrives when something you have invested significant effort in reveals that it did not hold. May walked to the edge of the rubble and looked at it. She looked at the exposed section of cliff face behind the failed wall, the raw stone newly revealed, and she looked at the extent of the loss and at the work that would be required to address it. She stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then she went and got her pickaxe. She had learned from her grandfather that the correct response to setback in stonework is not emotional. The stone does not share your disappointment. It does not care about the hours you have put in or the expectations you have built around the work. It is simply what it is, and what it requires now is what it required before: attention and effort and the willingness to begin again from wherever the setback has left you. She began clearing from the left side of the fall, moving the larger stones, first working methodically. Cal watched her for 30 seconds. Then he got his own pickaxe and started from the right. They worked through the afternoon. Silas arrived in the late morning and joined without being asked, hauling the heaviest pieces clear with the efficiency of a large man who knows how to use his body's weight correctly. No one spoke much. The work required too much attention for conversation, and besides, there was nothing to say that the work was not already saying. It was Silas who found it. He was clearing stone from the deepest section of the slide, the material that had been against the cliff face itself, when his foot pressed against a section of the exposed rock that felt different from the surrounding material. He knelt down. He looked closely at it, not touching, yet just looking at the color and grain and the way the light fell across the surface. Then he turned to May and said her name once in a tone that made her come immediately. She knelt beside him. The exposed section was roughly the size of a door revealed by the collapse of the retaining wall. The stone here was unmistakably different from the surrounding cliff face. Darker, grayer, textured differently, more layered, more fine-grained, with the blue-gray cast that May had learned to recognize with the certainty of someone reading a word they have known since childhood. She did not press her hand against it. She did not need to. She had been taught to read stone at a distance by a man who had spent 40 years underground, and she read this the way she had read everything else. He had pointed her toward with the combination of knowledge and recognition that happens when preparation meets its moment. "This isn't a seep vein," Silas said quietly. "The color pattern, the grain direction, the temperature differential." He put his own hand carefully against the surface. "This is the main fracture, the primary accumulation channel, the water source your grandfather described in the journal." He looked at her. "The first vein you found was a tributary." May sat back on her heels. She looked at the exposed wall. Then she looked at the rubble around them, 3 weeks of construction reduced to a clearing job. She looked at what the collapse had revealed, the section of cliff face that her grandfather had spent 20 years trying to reach. The terrace wall had not simply failed. The terrace wall had fallen in the one specific location that would expose the thing she had been working towards since October. Cal was watching both of them. "What is it?" "The main vein," May said. He looked at the wall, then at the rubble, then at his sister. Something in his face shifted as the calculation completed itself. The realization that the thing that had looked like a catastrophe was something else entirely. May stood up. She looked at the cliff above them, at the sky over it, at the valley below, where redemption sat in its ordinary confidence about how water worked and where it came from and how much there would always be. Silas stood up beside her and looked at the same things, though what he saw when he looked at them was slightly different: the engineering problem of how you open a primary fracture channel without destabilizing the formation above, and what it would make possible if you did it correctly. "How long?" May asked. "To open the main face properly, 6 weeks, maybe 8. He looked at the wall again. "But what comes out of it?" He stopped. "May, what comes out of it changes the calculation entirely." May looked at the blue-gray stone standing exposed before her, revealed by a collapse that had seemed like failure and turned out to be something else. "The earth does not waste anything either," she thought. "It simply makes you earn what it gives you in the way it decides." She picked up her pickaxe and handed Cal the sledgehammer and looked at Silas. 8 weeks, she said. "Let's start." Cal raised the sledgehammer. The sound it made against the blue-gray stone rang out across the valley in the late afternoon light, deeper than the sounds that had come before it. A different register entirely, the sound of something beginning, that had been a very long time in preparation. Inside the chamber behind them, in the small basin cut into the bedrock of the floor, the water from the tributary veins sat perfectly still in the lamplight, clear, cold, full to the brim, waiting as it had always waited for someone to come and do something worthy of it. August arrived the way bad things often arrive in the desert, quietly and without announcement, wearing the face of something familiar. The heat was not unusual for Arizona territory in summer. Heat was expected. Heat was managed, planned around, endured with the practical resignation of people who had chosen to make their lives in a place that did not moderate itself for their comfort. What was different was the absence underneath the heat, the way the creek ran lower each morning when the ranchers rode out to check it, the way the sky stayed clean of clouds for days and then weeks in a row with a clarity that would have been beautiful if it had not been so persistent. May noted the creek levels in the journal each week. She had been noting them since February, not because the journal required it, but because her grandfather had noted them decade by decade in his observations about the valley, and the pattern he had recorded over 30 years of occasional visits showed her something that the ranchers and farmers of Redemption, with their shorter memories and their reasonable confidence in what had always been sufficient, were not yet positioned to see. The creek had been declining for 3 years. Not dramatically, not in any single year enough to cause alarm. But the cumulative reductions set against the broader pattern of the valley's wet and dry cycles that Aldous had tracked across 3 decades told a different story than any individual season could tell on its own. May worked harder through July than she had worked at any previous point. The main vein behind the newly revealed wall had taken 6 weeks to open carefully, following the grain of the stone with the precision that Silas's engineering knowledge and her grandfather's field notes together made possible. What they found behind the blue-gray face was not a pocket or a seep. It was a fracture system running upward into the formation for a depth they could not fully measure, conducting water down from the high country above at a rate that filled their expanded basin overnight and had left them by the end of June with more water than they could immediately use. May did not waste a drop of it. She and Silas spent the better part of 3 weeks designing the distribution system channels, cut into the stone at carefully calculated grades, moving water from the main basin through the terrace levels by gravity alone. No pumping, no mechanical intervention. The water finding its own way along paths they had made for it, in the same way the mountain had been finding paths of its own for 10,000 years before they arrived. The terraces rebuilt after the February collapse, with modifications Silas incorporated to prevent the same failure mode, were planted by late spring. Potatoes first, then beans along the lower section where the morning sun reached longest. Kale across the broadest face of the third terrace, where the shallow soil held moisture better than May had expected. Hardy things, reliable things, the crops that asked least of the ground and gave most back. By July, the terraces were green in the specific, deliberate, almost defiant green of plants that are being properly watered in a landscape that is running short of water. From the valley below, the effect was visible from a considerable distance, this improbable cascade of living color against the stone face of Sentinel Bluff, unchanged in its dimensions and its ancient indifference, but wearing now on its lower quarter something it had not worn in any human memory. Growth. The goats arrived in early August. Getting them up the path May and Cal had cut into the cliff face occupied most of a long afternoon and exhausted all 3 humans and both animals in ways that were different in kind, but roughly equivalent in their completeness. Cal nearly lost his footing twice. Silas said things under his breath that he did not say aloud. The goats had opinions about the whole enterprise that they communicated at considerable volume. When they finally stood in the stone pen May had cut into the lower cliff face, they looked around at their new situation with the expression that goats always wear, one of complete certainty that they are surrounded by incompetence and settled in. May stood at the terrace railing and looked out at the valley. The creek was a thread now, visible from this height as a thin, dark line through the valley floor that caught the sun in places and disappeared in others. Not the living vein of water that had run through the center of Redemption's life for as long as anyone in the town could remember, but something diminished, something working very hard to continue being what it had always been. In the fields below, the green had gone yellow. Not all of it, not yet, but in patches, and then in larger areas, the color of healthy crops giving way to the color of crops that are asking for something the sky is not providing. You could see it most clearly in the mornings before the heat fully established itself, when the slant light picked out the difference between sections that had been irrigated from the creek and sections that had relied on rain, and the rain sections were losing the argument. May watched it the way her grandfather had watched things, with patient attention and without the comfortable assumption that what she was seeing would correct itself without intervention. She knew what was coming. The journal had told her. 30 years of careful observation written down in a book that had waited in a chest under a bed in a house she had sold had told her exactly what was coming. She went back to work. September arrived and the creek did not recover. October. The creek disappeared entirely. May was on the upper terrace checking the beanstakes on the morning that the last visible section of water vanished from the valley floor. She saw it from above, the way you see things differently from elevation, the moment when the thin dark line simply stopped being there, absorbed or evaporated or drained below the surface, in the final accounting of a year that had taken more than it gave. She stood for a moment with her hand on a bean vine and looked at where the creek had been. Then she went back to checking the stakes. In Redemption, the morning the creek died was the morning the town stopped arguing about whether things were serious. Edmund Crane had been managing the shortage with the practiced confidence of a man who has seen dry spells before and knows how to position himself advantageously within them. He had organized his warehouse inventory carefully. He had extended credit selectively. He had spoken in the reassuring tones of a man who has been through hard times and knows they end. But he had not anticipated a creek that simply stopped. The wells in town were drawing less each week. The cisterns were down to their last reserves. What Crane had managed as a shortage was becoming something else. Not a shortage, but an absence, which is a different kind of problem entirely. A shortage can be rationed and waited out. An absence has to be answered. By the end of October, children in Redemption were being fed one meal a day. May knew this because Cal made the supply runs to town now once a week, a habit they had established for practical reasons and maintained because Cal had a way with people that May, who had a different kind of way with people, did not. He came back with information along with the supplies, the state of the town's reserves, who was struggling most, what Crane was doing with his warehouse inventory. He came back one evening in late October and set the supply bag on the terrace table and did not immediately begin unpacking it. The Kessler family lost their youngest, he said. May stopped writing. The boy was 6. He'd been sick since August. They didn't have... Cal stopped. He sat down. They didn't have what they needed. The fire between them said nothing. The goats moved in the pen below. Somewhere in the upper regions of the cliff, the night wind found a fissure and passed through it, and the sound it made was not comfortable to hear. What's left in the cold storage? May asked. Cal looked at her. May, tell me. He calculated. Potatoes roughly 400 pounds remaining. Dried beans perhaps 60 pounds. Preserved kale. Goat cheese aging on the stone shelves, perhaps 40 pounds of it. Dried herbs. Eggs from the 8 chickens in the upper pen daily. Goat milk. That's enough to feed 2 people through spring, he said. Maybe into summer if we're careful. Yes, if we start sharing it. I know, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. There are people down there who called you worse things than Cliff Witch, he said, not accusingly, stating a fact that had weight and that he wanted acknowledged before whatever came next. I know that too. And you're thinking about feeding them anyway. May looked into the fire. She thought about her grandfather, about a man who spent 20 years developing knowledge about this valley that could have helped the people in it, who had tried once to share it and been sent away, turned away by a council of men who looked at him and saw only what he was not. He had not been bitter. The journal held no bitterness. It held precision and patience and an abiding faith in the idea that the truth of the earth was more durable than the errors of any particular group of men, and that eventually those errors would find their natural correction. If I don't help them, May said, then what is all of this for? Cal looked at the cliff around them, the stone walls of the home they had made the terraces visible in the lamplight above the system of channels carrying water from the mountain's interior to the growing things on its face, the whole elaborate patient structure they had built from nothing in a year of sustained effort. He did not have an answer for that, but he thought that her question was its own answer. We'll need more than food, he said finally. They'll need water, real water, not charity buckets. I know, May said. That's why I need them to come up here and help build what comes next. The knock came 4 days later. May heard it in the early morning before full light when the cliff was at its most still, and sound carried through the stone with unusual clarity. She was already awake as she usually was before dawn. She set down the journal and went to the entrance. Mrs. Doris Harper stood at the base of the path in the thin morning light. She was wearing her good coat, which struck May as significant, the choice of someone who has thought carefully about what they are doing. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better winters, was a child. A girl perhaps 4 years old. Her face in the early light had the particular pallor of a child who has been running a fever long enough for the fever to become ordinary. The girl's eyes were open, barely. They caught the lamplight May was holding and tracked it without much interest. Mrs. Harper looked at May. She had driven a wagon from town in the dark over ground she knew poorly, which was its own kind of statement about the state of things. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone who has been frightened for a long time and has finally arrived at the place they were going. She opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she said simply, "Please." May did not hesitate. She stepped back from the entrance and said, "Come in." She had broth on the fire within 10 minutes, made from the bones of the last chicken, long simmered with dried herbs from the upper terrace. The kind of thing you make when you understand that warmth delivered from the inside is what a sick child most needs. She poured it into a tin cup and wrapped the cup in cloth and carried it to where Mrs. Harper sat with the girl on the bench beside the main fire. "Small sips," May said. "Let her set the pace." She knelt down in front of the child. The girl's name was Lily, Mrs. Harper's daughter's youngest, 4 years old in November. She had been sick since October, the kind of sick that starts as a cold and settles deeper when the child is not getting enough to eat. Lily looked at May with the direct attention that very young children share, a regard uncomplicated by social calculation, purely observational. She accepted the cup and drank from it in small, deliberate sips. May watched her and felt something move through her chest that was not complicated and did not require analysis. It was simply the recognition that this was what the water was for. Not the water in the basin specifically, though the broth had been made with it. All of it. The whole year of it. The cliff and the stone and the 31 mornings of waking before dawn and the blood on the pickaxe handles and the terrace that had collapsed and the vein that had opened and the calculations done by firelight and the seeds pressed into soil carried up from the valley floor, bucket by bucket. It was all for this. For a 4-year-old girl named Lily to drink warm broth in the morning and have some color come back into her face. "She needs to eat regularly," May said, "daily, for at least a week." Mrs. Harper's hands were trembling slightly. She was holding them together in her lap to manage it. "I don't want to take what you—" "Come back tomorrow," May said. "Bring her. Come every morning until she's stronger." Mrs. Harper pressed her lips together very hard for a moment. Then she nodded. Word went out from Mrs. Harper without any instruction from May, the way word travels in a small town when it carries information that people need faster than any deliberate communication could achieve. By the next morning, there were 7 people at the base of the cliff path. By the morning after that, more than 20. May fed them. She was careful about quantities, precise in the same way she was precise about everything, calculating what the stores could sustain, over how long, how many people, how often. She did not give more than she could replace. But she gave what she could, and she gave it without conditions in the first days, simply because the need was in front of her and she had what it required. On the 4th day, Edmund Crane came. He did not come alone. He brought the pastor, a man named Whitfield, who had an honest face and the voice of someone genuinely accustomed to standing beside human suffering without flinching. He brought 2 members of the town council, and he came, May noted, on foot rather than horseback, which meant he had made a considered choice about how to arrive. They stood at the base of the cliff path in the late morning and looked up, and May came to the top of the path and looked down, and for a moment neither party moved. Crane took off his hat. She had heard Cal describe this as something unprecedented, and she understood now why he had said it. Edmund Crane was not a man who uncovered his head except in church and at funerals. He wore his hat the way he wore his authority, as a default condition of his existence, so automatic as to be nearly physical. Removing it was not a casual gesture. He turned the hat in his hands. "Miss Aldrin," he said. She waited. "We need help." He said it in the flat, direct way of a man who has decided that the most efficient path to something necessary is through honesty, even when honesty is painful, even when it means saying words he has never said before in this particular combination. The town is in serious trouble. The wells are nearly gone. The food stores are nearly gone. We have families that are not going to make it through to spring without something changing. "I know," May said. Crane nodded. "I imagine you do." He glanced at the terraces above her, at the green of them, at the system of channels and retaining walls, and the carved stone of the structure behind her. "I imagine you've known for some time." "Since February," she said. The creek data goes back further than that. My grandfather tracked it for 30 years. Crane held her gaze. He was a man who had built his life on knowing when to speak and when not to, and he understood with the instinct of long practice that something was coming that he was not going to be able to manage from behind a counter. "We came to ask if you would help us," he said. May looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Before I answer that, the number 3 shaft, the crossbeam." The air on the cliff face went very still. Crane's hands stopped moving on the brim of his hat. "My brother heard it from Reston," May said, "before you let him go." She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward. She stood at the top of the path in the morning light and said what she had been carrying for a year with the same directness she brought to everything. "It was flagged 3 weeks before the accident. You were notified. You told them to keep the shaft operating." The pastor looked at the ground. One of the council members shifted his weight. The other went very still. Crane stood with his hat in his hands and did not look away from her. He was 51 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life in the practice of knowing how situations worked and where they were going. And he understood with perfect clarity that there was nothing he could say here that would function as anything other than a confession or a lie, and he was too tired and too reduced for either one. "I know," he said. 2 words, just those 2, but they carried something in them that all his previous careful management had not the weight of a man who has been carrying something for a year and has finally set it down in the only place it was ever going to land. May was quiet for a long time after that. She thought about Eli, about his boots by the door and his hammer on the peg and the rocking chair he had made with a patience she had not known he had. She thought about 19 years old and $14 and a cliff and everything she had done in the year since she stood beside a pine box and decided to look up rather than down. Eli was not here. He would not be here. Nothing Crane said or did not say was going to change that, and she had known this since October of last year, had known it the morning she stood at the stove with the coffee pot in her hand and the truth settling into the room around her. She had made her choice then, not out of weakness, but out of clarity. She could not spend her force on what the rock had already taken. You worked with what remained. You went forward along the grain. "I'll help," she said, "but not with gifts." Confusion crossed several faces. The pastor stepped forward. "What do you mean?" "I'll provide food, water access from the upper basin which can be run down to the valley floor through channels we designed together. I'll share everything I know about how this system was built and how it works." She paused. "In exchange, I need labor, skilled and unskilled. Every person in this town who can swing a tool or carry a bucket. We're going to build water catchment systems. We're going to expand the terrace capacity. We're going to build what this valley needs to survive the next drought as well as this one, because this one will not be the last." Crane looked at her for a long time. "You're talking about months of work," he said. "Yes, through winter and into spring, possibly beyond." He looked at the cliff. He looked at the valley below. He looked at his hat in his hands. Then he looked at the pastor, who gave a small nod that contained within it the consensus of the group. "We agree," Crane said. What followed in the weeks after that agreement was something that Redemption had not experienced in its 30 years of existence, the sensation of a community working not toward any individual's advantage, but toward a shared necessity so fundamental that advantage became temporarily beside the point. It was not noble. May did not expect or require nobility. People came to work on Sentinel Bluff because they needed water and food, and because the alternative was something they could not afford to contemplate. They came with the specific motivation of survival, which is not an elevated motivation, but is reliable in a way that more elevated motivations often are not. Farmers came with strong backs and practical knowledge of soil and grade. Carpenters came with levels and squares and the ability to build structures that would bear weight in the specific applications May and Silas needed. Silas himself worked from early morning to last light every day, managing the engineering of the water distribution system with a precision and a speed that May recognized as the output of someone who has found the right problem after a long wrong turn. Even Edmund Crane came. Not every day, but enough days and working hard enough when he came that May noted it. He was not skilled at this kind of work in the way that the farmers and the miners and the tradespeople were skilled, but he was willing, and willingness in the right proportion can compensate for a great deal of skill deficit. Children carried seeds and sorted grain and refilled water basins. Women organized the cooking and the distribution of daily food rations with a logistical efficiency that May recognized as genuine talent, applied to genuine necessity, the particular organizational intelligence that emerges in communities when they stop pretending and start solving. May worked harder than any of them. This was not a performance or a strategy. It was simply what she did because it was what the work required and because she would not ask of anyone what she refused to do herself. Her hands bled most days, now the skin hardened, but the joints worked hard enough and long enough that the old injuries reopened, and she wrapped them in cloth and kept working. Her boots wore through the soles, and she lined them with folded canvas from the original tent and kept working. People noticed. They did not comment on it directly because something about watching May work made direct comment feel inadequate. But the noticing shaped how they worked alongside her in ways she did not manage or direct. They simply kept up. The water catchment system took 6 weeks to build in its first phase. Silas designed it, and May reviewed every element of the design against the logic of the cliff and the data in the grandfather's journal. And occasionally she would point to a section of the plan and say something about the stone formation at that location that Silas had not accounted for, and he would make the adjustment without defensiveness, which was one of the things May most respected about him. He was attached to the outcome, working not to his own ideas about how it should work. Those are different things, and not everyone can hold the distinction. The catchment used the natural geometry of the cliff face. The way rainfall moving down the upper sections of the stone was directed by the existing channels and angles of the rock towards specific collection points. From these points, channels cut into the cliff at precise grades moved the water to the twin reservoirs they had carved out of the solid stone at the base of the upper terrace section, each one large enough to hold several weeks of family supply for 20 people. And below the cliff on the valley floor, Silas designed a network of secondary channels that could move water from the cliff base out to the nearest fields, not enough to replace the creek for all farming purposes, but enough to keep kitchen gardens alive, enough to water livestock through a dry period, enough to change the calculation of survival in a dry year from a matter of hope to a matter of management. One evening, a group of men gathered at the fire after the workday to eat and to listen, which was a thing that had started happening organically without anyone organizing it. Among them was a rancher named Gideon Pell. Pell was a man of approximately 60 years, though he looked older than that in the particular way of men who have worked outdoors in a hard climate for 40 years. He had large scarred hands and a way of looking at things, terrain, weather, the face of a building, as if he were checking them against a prior estimate. He had worked steadily throughout the project without calling attention to himself, which May had noticed and respected. That evening, he was looking at the fire when he said, "Your grandfather, he came to the council, years back." May looked at him. Pell did not look up from the fire. He was a man who had been holding a thing for a long time and had decided the time for holding was finished. "I was the clerk's assistant," he said, "not a voting member. I was 23 years old, fresh to the territory assigned to the council, because I could write a straight line and keep my mouth shut." He paused. A man came with maps and surveys, said the cliff had water behind it, said if the town built catchment on the face of it, the valley could survive dry cycles. He looked at his hands. He was older. He had a miner's hands, working man's hands. The fire crackled. Around it, men who had been talking went quiet. "Crane's uncle ran the council then," Pell continued. "He said the man was a crank, said the surveys were amateur work, said there was no need to complicate the town's water situation with theories from somebody who wasn't trained and certified." He stopped, looked up at May. The man left. Nobody thought much about it after. "I thought about it sometimes. Not enough." May held his gaze. She said nothing. "I'm sorry," Pell said. She had thought about how she would feel when this came, because she had known for months that it would come in some form. She had thought she might feel anger. She had set a place for anger in her accounting of how this moment might go. She did not feel anger. She felt the weight of 36 years. A man with miner's hands and 3 geology books and 20 years of careful observation turned away from a door, taking his knowledge back into the desert, where it had waited in a chest under a bed until the right morning and the right pair of hands could use it. He knew they wouldn't listen, she said. He wrote it in the journal. He wrote that he expected to be turned away and that he went anyway because the record should exist, because someone should know that he had tried. She looked at the fire. He was not a man who needed credit. He needed the work to be done eventually. The silence around the fire was the specific silence of people sitting with something that has shifted their understanding of their own history. Silas spoke from the edge of the firelight where he had been sitting quietly through all of it. "I found the original record," he said. He reached into his coat and brought out a folded paper. In the land office files, the council meeting minutes from November 1851. I went looking last week. He looked at May. I thought you should know it was written down somewhere, that it's in the official record. May took the paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting of the council clerk who had recorded the meeting was precise and bureaucratic, the handwriting of someone whose job required accuracy rather than interpretation. The words were spare. The meeting, the presentation, the rejection, the date. November 14th, 1851. 36 years ago. Aldous Aldrin, age 39, had walked into redemption with his surveys and his maps and his 40 years of understanding the language of rock, and he had been told politely and finally that his understanding was insufficient. He had gone home and written it all down. He had written it all down so that eventually, when the time was right and the right person was ready, the knowledge would not be lost. He had trusted the future more than he trusted the council. May folded the paper carefully. She held it for a moment, the paper light in her hands, 36 years folded into a single sheet. Then she opened the grandfather's journal to the last pages. The pages that came after his final entry, the pages he had left blank. She set the council record inside the back cover. She looked at the last words he had written, at his name on the front page, at the trust he had placed in her that she had spent a year and everything she had to justify. She took the pencil from the journal's binding. She wrote on the blank page beneath his last entry in her own hand, which was different from his, less formal, shaped by different schooling and different years, but no less deliberate. She wrote, "You were right." Then she closed the journal and looked up at the cliff above them, at the dark face of the stone, running with the cold air of a November night, and said nothing more. The first clouds came in the third week of November, building over the high country to the north and moving south with the deliberate pace of weather systems that have no reason to hurry. May watched them from the upper terrace in the early mornings, checking the sky, the way her grandfather had taught her to check things, not once but repeatedly in different lights from different angles, patient with the time it took to understand what you were looking at. By the fourth morning, the clouds were different, lower, darker, with a quality of purpose that the observation clouds of the previous weeks had lacked. Silas looked at them from the terrace railing and said nothing for a long time. Then he went to check the catchment channels. May walked every element of the system that day, the path from the upper basin to the lower channels to the valley distribution network that a crew of 12 men had finished 3 days before. She checked joints and grades and the clearance of debris from the channel entries and the load capacity of the reservoir walls and the overflow channel that would, if everything had been built correctly, activate when the primary reservoirs filled and direct excess water to a secondary holding area cut into the valley floor itself. Cal walked with her through most of it. He had turned 18 in October, in the middle of the work, without ceremony or celebration, because there had been no time for ceremony, and he had not wanted celebration, and he was not 17 anymore. In any sense that mattered. He was something else now, something that had been 17 and had gone through a year of sustained difficult work and come out the other side shaped by it in ways that would not reverse. They walked the channel from the upper terrace to the valley floor without speaking much. The air had changed. It held a new quality, a weight and a dampness that the Arizona Territory air had not held in months, and the smell of it was different. Not the dry mineral smell of desert air, but something older and fuller, the smell of water in the sky looking for a reason to come down. By evening, the whole population of Redemption was at the base of Sentinel Bluff. They had come without being summoned, which was the thing May noted and held. No one had organized this. No one had sent word that everyone should gather here. They had simply come in the way that people move towards shelter when they feel weather building, following some calculation older than any of their stated reasons for doing anything. They stood on the valley floor and on the path and on the lower terrace sections, and they looked up at the clouds now moving directly overhead, blocking the stars, a ceiling lowering itself over the valley with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. Edmund Crane stood below the retaining wall of the first terrace with his hat in his hands again. He looked older than he had in the summer, the events of the fall having taken something from him that was not purely physical. He looked up at May on the terrace above. He did not say anything. After a moment, he nodded once slowly. The nod of a man acknowledging something that cannot be unsaid and does not need to be said again. May nodded back. The rain began at approximately 10 in the evening. Not gently, not as a suggestion. The desert does not begin things gently when it has been withholding them for 8 months. It delivers them with the complete conviction of something that has been waiting and has now run out of patience. The rain came all at once, the full weight of a winter storm that had organized itself in the high country over several weeks and arrived in redemption, resolved in total hammering the valley floor with a sound like continuous low thunder and filling the arroyos within minutes and raising the smell of wet desert earth, which is a smell unlike any other, sharp and mineral and overwhelming in its intensity, the smell of land receiving something it urgently needed. The people on the cliff did not scatter for shelter. They had shelter behind them in the chambers May had carved from the mountain, and they had the overhang of the cliff face itself, which extended far enough to keep the upper terrace mostly dry. They stayed and watched. And then the catchment channels filled. May heard it before she saw it, the specific sound of water moving through cut stone at a grade. The low organized rushing that was different from the rain sound around it, directed rather than falling. The upper channels were full and running the water they had caught from the cliff face above, feeding down the system exactly as Silas's calculations had predicted, hitting the first reservoir with a sound that was audible even over the storm. The first reservoir filled in 20 minutes. May had measured its capacity and calculated the fill rate, and had expected this, but the expectation and the reality were different things, because the expectation is a number, and the reality is the sound of water hitting stone and rising, and the lamplight catching the surface as it came up, the image of something that had not been here a year ago, now filling with water that had traveled 40 miles from the high country to arrive here tonight. The overflow channel activated. It made a sound when it opened, a rush and a deepening of the water noise from the east side of the upper terrace, and then the water was visible, running clean and fast down the secondary channel toward the valley floor, directed precisely toward the holding area on the flat ground below, filling it steadily while the primary reservoir continued to rise. From below, voices. Not words exactly. The sound of people reacting to something they can see and feel and understand with their bodies rather than their minds. Then the second reservoir began to fill. Then the lower channels to the valley distribution network opened under the water pressure running clear and cold down toward the dry fields below. Cal appeared beside May at the terrace railing. His face was wet from the rain coming at them sideways. He looked at the system, working at the water running through every channel they had cut, following every grade Silas had designed, hitting every collection point May had argued for against her own uncertainty in the months when she could not be fully certain of anything. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment. Then he went to help redirect the valley floor channels that needed adjustment as they filled. Silas came to stand beside her. He was carrying the engineering drawings rolled under his arm, covered in a piece of canvas against the rain. He had been walking the system since it activated, checking it against the plans, noting what matched and what had exceeded the design specifications, in the way that properly built things sometimes exceed their specifications when the underlying conditions are better than the most conservative estimate. "It works," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The rain hammered the stone around them, and the channels ran, and the reservoirs held, and the valley floor below received what it had been denied for 8 months. "Your grandfather would have seen this immediately," Silas said. "How it all connects. He would have understood the whole system from a single look." May looked at the cliff above them, the dark face of the stone running with rain, the ancient formation holding its secrets and releasing them in the precise order she had requested. "He did understand it," she said. "He understood it 30 years before we built it." The rain continued through the night. By morning, the primary reservoir was holding at capacity, the overflow running steadily to the secondary basin. The valley floor holding area was full. The distribution channels to the nearest fields were running. The creek, dry since October, had come back as a dark line of moving water visible from the terrace railing, fed by the rain, and by the runoff from the catchment, and by whatever the high country was sending down in the general restoration of what 8 months of drought had taken. The goats came to this pen railing and looked at the running water with the satisfied expression of animals that have strong opinions about hydration. The chickens were audible from the upper pen. The bean vines had been battered by the overnight rain, but they were standing the root systems deep enough in the terrace soil to hold. May stood at the terrace railing in the early morning light and looked at what was in front of her. Below her, the Valley of Redemption was waking in the rain. Smoke rising from chimneys, people emerging into the wet morning to look at the water running in the channels and in the returning creek. She watched a group of children run to the edge of the valley distribution channel and crouch down to touch the water moving through it. Their voices came up to her, faintly carrying something that had been absent from the town for months. She did not try to identify it more precisely than that. Cal brought coffee. He stood beside her, and they drank it and watched the valley below them begin to move again, with the specific energy of a place that has received what it needed. Silas came up the path from below his coat, wet through his expression, that of a man who has been checking something he built and found it sound. He accepted the cup Cal offered him and stood on the other side of May, and the three of them were quiet for a time. May went inside. She sat at the small table they had built from stone and the salvaged lumber of two wooden crates, and she opened the grandfather's journal. She turned to the last pages, the pages after his final entry, the pages she had been adding to since she arrived. Her own handwriting sat alongside his, now different in its shape, and similar in its care, the record of what she had found when she followed where he had pointed. She turned to where she had written 3 nights ago. You were right. She held the pencil. She looked at what she had written. Then she added a line beneath it. We finished it. She sat with the journal open in front of her for a long time. The rain on the cliff outside made it sound steady and patient, falling through the catchment system and into the channels and into the reservoirs and down toward the valley and into the earth and through the stone to the fracture systems that had been moving water down from the high country since before the territory had a name. Inside the chamber, faintly but clearly, the sound of dripping. The main vein behind its blue-gray wall doing what it had done for 10,000 years. Drip, drip, drip. The sound of something that had been here before any of them arrived and would be here after all of them were gone, patient and precise, and utterly indifferent to whether anyone was listening. But someone was listening now. Someone had come with the right tools and the right knowledge and the right willingness to work, and she had found what the mountain had been holding, and she had built something worthy of it. May closed the journal. She held it in both hands for a moment, the weight of it familiar now in a way it had not been on that first night when it was still her grandfather's book, and she was still figuring out whether she was equal to what it was asking of her. She set it on the table. Outside, the rain continued. The channels ran. The reservoirs held. The children's voices carried up the cliff face from the valley below, bright and clear in the wet morning air. And in the cold dark of the chamber behind her, the mountain kept its slow, meticulous count drop by drop by drop, the way it had kept count through every drought and every flood and every generation of people who had lived in this valley and forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. The earth had been waiting a long time for someone to come and listen. May Aldrin had come. She had listened. That was enough. That was everything.